We are now live public on YouTube. Kick it off.
All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Christy Linneville. I'm our UX director. Welcome to the UX group conversation. If you look in the agenda, our slides are posted. And if you have questions, you can please add them to the agenda and then also help take notes about the responses. And I'm going to look and see if we have some questions. We do. Sid has some questions for us. Let me look at slide 9. So Sid wanted us to elaborate on slide 9. And this is actually Catherine Para added this one. So Catherine, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Can you give me a second to read? Elaborate on slide 9. Okay, so just to give an overview of what was going on in that study. So basically we had 3 proposals for changing the way that labels are displayed on boards, kind of mainly with the goal of helping people reduce the noise and like see more issues at once. And what we were kind of investigating there was what are the different needs that people have based on their planning methods. And what we found there is that some users were kind of adverse to the idea of toggling off all labels because, hey, I need that information there. That information communicates something about the teams that I'm planning for, or it communicates something about the cycle time. Whereas there are other users who don't need that information at all. Say they're just coming in to triage issues or like groom a backlog or things like that, and they're more concerned with seeing a large volume of issues at once versus like the details about them. So basically what we kind of landed on is that we'll move forward with the proposal to toggle on or off all labels as an MVC, but what might be more beneficial is actually granularity. So the ability to create a label set based on some property. So say we have labels that are related to things like personas or our teams that don't need to be seen by everyone at once. You could potentially turn that off based on what you want to actually see, but that's a future step. But yeah, that's the main overview. Hopefully that made sense.
Sid, do you have any additional questions?
Yeah, well, I have 2, thanks for that. And I have 2 things I wonder about. One of them, if we still ask the user whether they want to add the default labels. I always thought that was a question kind of at the wrong time. Like when you first go to an issue board, they ask, the question used to be like, hey, do you want to add the default set of labels? And I think we should just add them and not confront the user with a question they don't know the answer to at that time. And kind of make sure that GitLab works out of the box instead of people having to make all kinds of decisions and end up and make a decision that they're really not empowered to make at that time. We should be making decisions and then allow them to change that. But I don't know whether we still ask that question or whether we were able to get rid of that.
I'm also not sure whether we still ask that question. Does anyone have context on that? Maybe on the plan team?
Yeah, Sid, I can answer that. So I've been working with Gabe Weaver, who's our PM for project management on that. Yeah, because you've asked about that pretty recently. And there's some complication in doing that. So if we make those labels default for every board. So right now, just to give everyone else context, if you make a new board, there's a open column, there's a closed column, and there's a column in the middle that says, hey, do you want to add these 2 other columns, which is, I think, to do or backlog. And basically by doing so, if we just made those columns there by default, we would have to ensure that like those labels existed on every project that ever made a board. And so if users don't want those labels in their label sets, basically every time we do that, we're forcing them to essentially go and clean up their label sets every single time. We're also forcing a few clicks every time users who maybe know how to use boards already are making new boards. And so that's why we haven't activated on that, Sid, because it's not just as there's other considerations. Does that make sense?
I don't think every time you create a board, you create those labels like that. suppose you create 10 boards, and 10 times you have to remove the labels. Why not create those labels every time a person creates a project? And that's a one-time thing.
What if they don't want those labels at all?
Then they can remove them. But like having 2 labels in a project when you start doesn't strike me as something that would get people very upset. I would get upset if every time I create a new board, you add the labels. So, but I think we shouldn't apply like the way it currently works to like the future state. I think it can be on project create.
Okay, I can take that back and think about it.
Cool. One of the ways so this is about 1A, same view. One of the reasons that Trello is so popular is that it gives everyone the same view. Like with things like Jira and GitLab, you're never sure whether you're looking at kind of the same board as someone else. I'm not sure what my point is, but I keep thinking about that, about how important it is that it's like a lot of what we do at GitLab is giving everyone the same perspective. And instead of kind of like we have this flexibility where we basically allow people to query the issues they want to see in a board, but also how important it is for people to have a shared view that everyone just kind of has by default and that people can fall back on for the simpler use cases. No specific suggestions. I'll move on. Not sure it's slide 15, like it's the UX of Monitor. But I see what we're doing. I think I'm missing the bigger picture in Monitor. I think in Monitor, you want to kind of go from alert to metric to log to tracing. And I don't see us I see that as like the job to be done there. And I don't see us aiming for that use case. I think Datadog has done an amazing job at addressing that use case where you can easily go from metrics and then see the relevant logs. I think Net Data is also onto something with like really fast updating metrics. I recorded a video, so I'll stop talking about it here, but I'd love to see us have a bit more of a vision where we're going to end up with Monitor. Because I think right now we're kind of thinking from functionality instead of workflows. And I'd love for the UX department to take the lead there and sketch that vision.
Yeah, that's something that we can definitely partner with our product managers to do. And you mentioned that you recorded a video, Sid. Is that something that you could share with us?
Yeah, it's on the 2CI. Someone added it. Thanks, whoever that person was.
Yeah, and Sid, I reviewed that video, and Dove and Sarah and I, the PMs in Monitor, also created an issue to update our vision, including creating some sketches with the product design team. So I'll link that issue here too.
Cool. And can we make sure that we also link that issue from the comments under the video, so it's easy for people to find one from the other?
Cool. I like it. We'll do.
Thanks.
All right. Christopher, you have a question.
Yeah, slide 4 shows some user experience scores, which whenever I think about elementary school and getting grades, I always like to get high grades. So, I think we just got started with that evaluation. And, I'd just like to get some perspective on, like what the overall goal is and kind of how we're thinking about it from that perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, we didn't love the grades that came out either. We do have a defined grading rubric for what each of those grades means in the handbook, so you can get a better sense of when we say something is a C, what does the C mean? But the plan is to push those grades up. So the point was to have a baseline score that calls out specifically where we have found pain points. And then we also created issues based on recommendations for improving those scores. And then we're working closely with product management to prioritize those for changes. So slide 4 in particular is talking about documentation improvements to those jobs to be done. So, but let me talk about just the experience baselines first, and then I'll tie it back to the documentation. So ideally, so our OKR for experience baselines, we did 15 experience baselines last quarter. Our goal this quarter was to improve 7 of those by 1 letter grade. On slide, let's see, 3, you'll see we have 5 of those experience baselines that have been prioritized by product management for improvement. So we're pretty close. So tying that back to documentation, we know that we need to improve our documentation. The documentation team's really focused on that as well. The question becomes, because we have a lot of documentation, where do you start? Well, when we worked with product management, they identified these jobs to be done as the most impactful parts of their particular stages. So it makes sense that we'd want to start by focusing on the things that are the most used and the most important. So our tech writing team is proactively going back to those workflows in the documentation and making improvements. Our goal was to hit 10 of those during this quarter. I'm not sure if we'll hit all 10, but they're making some really good progress on that. And then also, as part of the experience baseline efforts that the design team drove, documentation improvements were part of those experience baselines as well. So they really tried to cover the end-to-end experience, including how documentation ties into that. So when the technical writing team focuses on that, they will look at those specific issues, but they'll actually go beyond that just to look at the docs of that entire workflow and also see where they think improvements are needed. Does that help?
Yeah, that helps a lot. Just remember it from the previous discussion and figured it was worth expanding on. Appreciate it.
That's a great question. Sid.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate how much I love the experience baselines. And Christopher, I agree, the report cards aren't great, but let's not shoot the messenger. Well, that's
it's actually
violent analogy, but I love that it's in our face now, and I think that's a great job by the UX team. And I think the numbers are fair, and the way to fix them is to work with product and engineering to make it better. So I love it. I love the process. I love the videos, and I think it's really like what we were missing, and this is a great way to drive that.
Yeah, it really wasn't about calling out as much as it's emphasizing the fact that we're just getting started in this area. And whenever you start measuring something for the first time, your results are probably going to be very varied from your expectations. And you just got to take that and then start working from it right then and there to say, okay, how are we going to improve on that? So that's kind of my thought process as well.
Yeah, I'm glad that this has been such a useful exercise. I want to say I am so proud of my team for one, coming up with the approach and then the way that they executed on it. I think, it's been really useful for us too as a team, but I'm glad that it's been useful across the board. So thank you, UX department, for all of that. Eric Brinkman.
Hey, Christy, just a quick question. On slide 6, you talk about our SUS score. It looks like we're 56% of completion for our next measurement. When's the next score coming out? When can we expect that?
Yeah, Catherine is working on that now. So she's got it set up and she's getting it ready to send out. We'll send it out by September 30th. I only know that because she very proactively updated me on that this morning. And then we'll have the score by the end of the quarter. So by the end of October, we'll know what that is. I am realizing now as we're talking about this that I did not do a good job on this slide number 6. When I talked about 56% of all phases being complete, that specifically was related to our pajamas effort. It was not related to the SUS effort. And that is not clear the way that I put it. So
no worries. And just to refresh my own memory, this is our 3rd data point for SUS score. So we'll now start to kind of see a trend. And so, okay, cool. Did we do anything where we would expect that score to kind of trend back up? I know there was a small dip that was kind of within the error range from our first data point to our second. Do we expect it to go back up or flat?
The short answer is I legitimately don't know, but I'll tell you what we think over the long term will impact it. So I think it's 2 things. One is I think we're getting more of a focus on when we launch things today. We are putting more of a focus on launching things with a better experience right out of the gate. So I think that as we do more of that, that will help. The other thing that we've got to do ties back to why we're doing this experience baselines effort is going back and cleaning up all of the experiences that are already there, all of that UX debt. And so we do expect the experience baselines to have an impact on that. Now, realistically, that's going to take a little bit of time. So, we have 5 experience baselines that are scheduled for improvements this quarter, but they have to get implemented, and they got to get in there, and people have to use them, and they have to see the difference. And then also, I'm not sure what the critical mass of changes is going to be to really affect that overall score, right? So SUS is a long-term metric that we want to see change over time, but it could take quarters for us to really start to see the type of change we want to see. That doesn't mean that it's not valuable, though. We need to be looking at it long-term. So, we've got individual research efforts that help us gauge usability of more specific things in the short term, and we'll continue to do that. But the SUS is that big overall score. Does that help? Cool.
Yep, that's great. Thank you.
Pedro.
Yeah, actually, I have a question related to the SUS. I didn't write down, but I just wondered, would it be helpful for us to do, because it's fairly easy to do a SUS survey, would it be helpful for us to do an internal SUS and compare that with the external SUS to see how much of our own experience with GitLab differs from the rest of the community?
Ask me that a different way.
So we might think for in a specific area of the product that it's very usable, that people love using the feature, and that might differ from the opinions of users from the wider community. So having this, just comparison, would that be helpful?
Okay, I think I got you now. So, so I think what you're doing is you're saying, okay, so we've got this overall SUS score, but we also have done our own internal measurements in our category maturity model about where we think we are on smaller parts of the product. How do we validate that how we've scored those things aligns with how our users think about those things? Am I getting you right?
No, it would be just because the SUS score is quantitative. So it provides you with a numeric value. Mm-hmm. Let's imagine that if we did an internal SUS survey, we would get a very high score, for example, because GitLabbers love to use GitLab and they think it's mostly flawless, for example. And the external survey would reveal that we actually have a lower score. Maybe that's a good way to surface that we actually, when we make UX decisions and product decisions, we're very closed into our own use cases and to our own perception of usability of GitLab.
Okay, I am 100% understanding you now. Got it. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the idea of running an internal SUS, I think, is a reasonable request. Catherine, since you've run the past couple, do you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. Due to I guess I won't go into the questions in case we actually do run it. I think you'll find that it might surprise you, the responses you get even internally. So that might just be an interesting exercise anyway, because we have a lot of new GitLabbers. So they're very, very fresh to GitLab as a product. So they might not have the same love and loyalty as like a longer term user. So it could be interesting just to see how that goes.
Yeah, I agree. I think this is an interesting idea. Why don't we take this off of this call and think about what might make sense around this. Yeah, thanks, Pedro. Cool idea.
Cool. And my last question is regarding the documentation OKR. How are we going to measure improvements?
Mike Lewis, I will defer to you on this one.
Sure. So I think the way we constructed the OKR, firstly, we're going to be rerunning the general experience baseline reviews to see overall for that specific job to be done, did we move the needle as a team? So documentation plus UX and everyone else. Specifically in terms of the documentation pieces, we've set a number of specific goals for each job to be done. So for example, evaluate SEO around, can you easily find the use case in the documentation and how to complete it? So we're sort of comparing a before and after and making the changes to get to that after. So, before I couldn't find how do I do X in GitLab in the docs. Now I can search Google or I can search our own docs and I can find it. Individual documentation problems as well. So there was a gap in the docs where we didn't even cover how to do X, and now we have it. So it's been more of a before and after kind of check on specific points that each issue as part of the OKR has, if that answers the question.
Yeah, so but it would be more of our perception on the documentation, not necessarily the users and the people that consume the documentation.
Yeah, I don't think we're doing documentation testing in this way right now. It's something that Christy and I have spoken about a bit, and we can consider how to build that in as part of actually gauging how we're addressing the jobs to be done. I think it goes back to the broader question of of the overall experience baseline process. I think there's a separate question as well of how we test the docs. Like, do we want to include, like right now we make it easy to create an issue or a comment on a doc, but we've thought about, should we add some sort of rating? A lot of doc sets have to make it really easy to say, yes, this was helpful. If not, what was missing? So, in previous companies, I've done that kind of thing, and we've been able to get kind of numbers, grouping docs as a set and looking at how many negative comments or how many problems are cropping up as a whole. So we're thinking about that as well. I think we have an issue around how do we group docs in order to, rather than looking at one doc at a time, look at a set of docs. For example, all the docs that pertain to one stage or group, how are their numbers trending in terms of feedback we're getting back in? So this is something we're actively thinking about, but it doesn't really speak to this, this OKR or this process. We're using a specific process for this to move these individual baselines forward.
Cool, thank you.
Thanks, Pedro.
We've got a couple of minutes left. Any other questions?
This is Cynthia. If I could actually just follow up on the question around the docs there. I know that Mike, you had done a little bit of review on things like support tickets and kind of if there were docs or MRs or issues that were kind of related to that. I'm wondering if there's any work being done around those, like looking at those jobs and around the OKR and looking at whether we're getting more or less support tickets specifically on asking those questions.
So I think the thrust of what we've worked on is making sure that support feels empowered to contribute to the documentation. So both to use the documentation in responses to make the responses efficient, but also contribute back to the documentation when that's not present. So I think we have some numbers where I believe support is proactively looking at how often we're actually linking to the documentation in our responses, and we want that to go up. But in terms of any other broad-based tracking of numbers, we haven't quite been doing that. We've been thinking about, should we be looking at the source of our documentation MRs, like which team was the source of those, and tracking some other metrics. So I think there's more we could be doing, and that's kind of the way I've been thinking about it. Plus, periodically going back and sharing good examples of support-generated MRs. I think that's also a good idea. So I've been thinking about the best way of identifying those. Maybe that's something that I could talk to support leadership to kind of find a way of calling out.
I love the idea of seeing the impact of better docs on lower support tickets. Yeah, and if that's something that you'd be willing to collaborate with us on, Cynthia, that'd be great.
Yeah, thanks. I hate to say I'm less involved with the metrics, and that's more at the managerial level, but I definitely am always free to bring in ideas or sit in and see what we can do.
Yeah, even just point us in the right direction on your team. Okay, Eric Brinkman, I think you have the last point.
Yeah, it's not really a question, more of a comment, but just saying nice job and reiterating Sid's point on loving the experience baselines. As a shadow this week, there have been at least 2 times externally where Sid has highlighted that work to both in a talk and both to a customer, using them as an example of what makes us different, defensible, and differentiated. And so I just wanted to share that as a cool kind of anecdote I've experienced as part of the shadow program, and say good job.
Thanks for that, especially in this venue, because I know probably a good part of the UX department is here and they got to hear that. So thank you.
Welcome.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. These are great questions. Really enjoyed it.